Hey everyone, at the time of this video, Israel has been in the news a lot. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of discussion from a Christian evangelical standpoint as to whether Israel can rightly be referred to as the people of God. So there's a lot of discussion of that on social media and on YouTube. There's a lot of people saying yes. There's also a lot of people saying no because of the church and because what God is doing with the church, that we can't refer to Israel as a nation as the people of God anymore. And so I just wanted to offer my thoughts on this particular issue. In short, I will be answering yes to the question, is Israel as a nation still the people of God? And as we say that, though, there need to be some important clarifications so that there are no misunderstandings concerning what we mean by that. Now, when I've been listening to some people or watching some people who have been saying, no, we shouldn't be referring to Israel as a nation, as the people of God, I think oftentimes they're relying on some incomplete information. They may be referring to certain texts talking about Gentiles becoming the people of God and other things like that, and then make the conclusion that national Israel can't be the people of God. And so I wanted to present what I think is a more complete picture, looking at several texts, also paying attention to the significant section of Romans 9 to 11. So I am going to argue that I do think Israel is the people of God, but we also have to explain explicitly what we mean by that, and also take into account the issue of the remnant of Israel and believing Gentiles and other factors. Now, I think before we get into specific statements about this particular issue, I did want to note that God's purposes for Israel in the Bible are multiple and they're complex. And by that, what we mean is God is dealing with Israel as a nation, and he's also dealing with individual Israelites. Now, it's also true he's going to be dealing with Gentile nations and also individual Gentiles as well. But as we're talking about Israel as the people of God, we must keep into account the national aspect, which is significant, and then also the individual aspect. Now, oftentimes in church history, theologians often focus on what God is doing for individuals. And of course, we need to do that because the Bible does. But it's often not also understood that God is dealing with nations as national entities. And we say accounting for nations is part of what we call a new creation model. Remember, a new creation model, which we've talked about in other videos, is we're trying to detect all that God is doing in history. So if you read passages like Isaiah 19, it talks about Israel as the people of God, but it also talks about Egypt being the people of God, and Assyria and Egypt and Assyria doing various things as nations. So there's a lot of talk about nations in the Bible, and we have to account for that. So when we're dealing with the issue of Israel, we want to understand what it means corporately and nationally, and then also when it comes to individuals. And I also think on this second paragraph that I have here that although we're not going to take time to go through Deuteronomy 30 or even passages like Leviticus 26, it is important to understand that there are big picture passages which lay out Israel's history from the past, present, and the future. Deuteronomy 30, for example, talks about Israel en route to possessing the land of promise, as what will occur in Joshua, the book of Joshua. And then there's also discussion in Deuteronomy 30 that after Israel's been in the land, they will eventually disobey God and then end up having a dispersion and a scattering to the nations. But it's also important to understand that in texts like Deuteronomy 30, there's also a discussion of national Israel being brought back to the land, and that being connected with Israel's salvation and restoration. So we have to understand that when the Bible talks about Israel and unbelief, it's also understood from foundational text that that's going to be followed someday, and we don't know when that is, but someday by a restoration and a salvation that is involved. Now let's go to these particular issues and questions. And so I put these in the form of questions, and then I give answers to these. And again, this is to address the issue, is Israel the people of God? Now, first of all, when it comes to number one, can an individual Israelite be saved, go to heaven, or enter the kingdom of God based only on his or her physical or ethnic relationship to Abraham, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And the answer to that is no. No one is going to be saved simply because of their ethnicity. And that is also true for an Israelite. Now, number two, is explicit faith in Jesus required for an ethnic Israelite to be saved? And we offer an emphatic yes to that. The Bible teaches that one must believe in Jesus in order to be saved. Number three, is corporate ethnic national Israel as a whole now saved? And the answer to that is no. So for those of us who do believe that national Israel is the people of God, that is not a statement that Israel currently is in belief or Israel currently is saved. That is not the case. Number four, Are there individual Israelites who are saved? And the answer to that is yes. So that's been true in Old Testament times. That was true at the time of Jesus. It's been true throughout the church age. There are individual Israelites who are saved. As a matter of fact, that is a big part of Paul's discussion in Romans chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. I quote to you here Romans 11:5, where Paul says, "In the same way then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice." So there are individual Israelites who believe, and they are referred to as the remnant. Now that brings us to number 5. How does the Bible identify individual believing Israelites? Galatians 6:16 refers to them as the Israel of God. So an ethnic Israelite who is a believer in Jesus the Messiah from a Christian perspective is referred to as the Israel of God. Believing individual Israelites would also be the remnant of Israel that is discussed specifically in Romans 11, 1 to 10. And they would also be the Israel within Israel that Paul discusses in Romans 9:6, where he says they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. Most theologians believe, the overwhelming majority, that in Romans 9:6, Paul is talking about ethnic Israelites who believe. Now, number 6, how do individual believing Israelites relate to Israel as a whole? And so we would believe that the remnant of Israel is still connected with Israel. So they are still part of Israel. Now, I also want to say, too, that believing Israelites in this age are part of the church. If you read Ephesians 2:11 through 3:6, Paul talks about believing Gentiles along with believing Israelites being fellow members of the body, fellow heirs. And he talks about how they're participating in the blessings that have come through Christ. So believing ethnic Israelites are part of the church, but they're still identified as the Israel of God. They're still identified as the remnant of Israel. And they are also one of the reasons why God has not rejected his people. In Romans 11, 1 to 2, Paul says, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he?" Now, when he makes that statement, he's dealing with Israel as a whole in unbelief. If you want proof for that, just read the first few verses of Romans 9, where Paul says he wishes he could be accursed for the sake, of his kinsmen and brethren who are Israelites. Now, he says, God has not rejected his people, has he? So when it comes to Israel and unbelief, the question might be, has God rejected Israel? And he's saying God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. And then he appeals to the remnant of which he is one as to why not. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul considered himself as an ethnic Israelite as part of the remnant. And that's also part of the reason God has not rejected Israel. Now, if you read Romans 11 as a whole, Paul's going to give basically a twofold argument why God has not rejected Israel. In Romans 11, the first 10 verses, he makes the appeal to the remnant of believing Israelites in this age. Not Israel as a whole, not all Israel, but individual Israelites who believe. They're part of the remnant, and he's a part of that as well. And then when you get to verses 11 through 27 of Romans 11, Paul starts talking about the coming salvation and fullness of all Israel as an entity. But it is important to understand that the remnant of believing ethnic Israelites is part of the reason why God has not rejected Israel. And then, as we mentioned, the believing remnant of Israel leads to the coming salvation of all Israel, which is discussed in Romans 11 through 27. Now, that brings us to our 7th question and point. Is corporate Israel the chosen people of God? Now, this is where it gets a little bit more controversial, but is corporate Israel the chosen people of God? And the answer to that is yes. Passages like Deuteronomy 7, verse 6 states this: "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." Amos 3:2 says, "You only have I chosen or known among all the families of the earth." So there's a lot of statements in the Old Testament that Israel has been chosen. I think of Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 to 3, where God told Abraham, "I'm going to bless you, but I'm also going to make a great nation from you," which would be Israel. And then in you, Abraham and that nation, all the families, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So God has chosen Israel. That choosing of Israel is going to be linked with service to the families of the earth and the nations. The most significant way that occurs is through being the seed line for the coming Messiah we know as Jesus of Nazareth. but it's also going to involve blessings, not only spiritually, but physically when all things are said and done. And of course, all of that will take place because of Christ. The world never gets blessed apart from Christ, but Christ comes from Israel. And as a result, the servant, according to Isaiah 49, not only save Israel, but also bless the families of the earth. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of passages that talk about Israel's election as a nation. Now, some people might say, well, that's the Old Testament. We get to the New Testament. Jesus is the ultimate Israelite, and there's a redefinition of the people of Israel. And we want to affirm Jesus as the ultimate Israelite. That is absolutely true. But according to Isaiah 49, Jesus as the ultimate Israelite means the salvation of Israel. That's what Isaiah 49, 3-6 is about, and also bringing blessings and light to the nations as a whole. So it's very important to understand that Jesus's role as the ultimate Israelite does not mean the non-significance of the nation Israel. It means the salvation of the nation Israel and blessings going to the Gentiles. But as we talk about this point 8 here, we do want to affirm that Israel's election by God is reaffirmed in the New Testament. So remember, the standpoint that we're arguing for is great continuity between Old Testament expectation and New Testament fulfillment. And in the case of Israel's election, it's reaffirmed in the New Testament explicitly. We're told here in Romans 11, 28-29, that from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So that's what we call an explicit reaffirmation of a truth revealed previously. That from the standpoint of God's choice, from his election, which goes to show you that God's choosing and electing purposes not only involve individuals, but they also involve the nation of Israel. And then also notice in verse 29 that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So that calling of God involves the calling of Israel for service and the national implications that are linked from that. So we know from Romans 11, 28-29, that God's election of Israel as a nation is an explicit doctrine, and it's reaffirming what was stated in the Old Testament. And we also have Romans 11, 1-2, where Paul says, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? Notice he's calling Israel in unbelief his people. Now, he's not saying Israel in unbelief is saved, but he is saying that Israel in unbelief is still his people. Now, some people were starting to think, well, some time has gone by since Jesus arrived in Israel as a whole as an unbelief. Maybe God's rejected Israel. This seems to be the beginnings of what could be called replacement theology or supersessionism. But Paul says here, God has not rejected his people. He goes on to say, may it never be. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And when you get into that foreknew language, that sounds a lot like the Amos 3:2 text that we referred to earlier, where you only have I known among all the families of the earth. So it's interesting that oftentimes we see God's choosing and knowing of people in the New Testament in regard to believers, but it's also, in addition to that, true of Israel as a nation. So God has not rejected his people. And this should settle the argument once and for all, whether Israel can be referred to as the people of God in unbelief, because Paul says that here. God has not rejected, notice, his people. Now, he is not saying Israel is saved at this point, but there is still that covenantal relationship that God has with Israel to such a degree that Israel can be referred to as his people. Now, when we come to point 9 here, what does corporate Israel being the people of God mean? Now, we've already stated it doesn't mean that Israel currently is in belief or Israel currently is saved or that every individual Israelite of all time is saved. But it does mean that God is in covenant relationship with the nation Israel. His plans for them as a nation, which includes temporary unbelief, are still in play. So that covenant relationship still continues. Now, remember, according to the Abrahamic covenant, Israel is in covenant relationship with God. The Abrahamic covenant is an irrevocable covenant in which all of its dimensions are in play. And so Israel is in covenant relationship with God. And then we should note also that the things Paul mentions in Romans chapter 9, verses 4-5, currently still belong to Israel. And I think we really need to think deeply upon these couple verses here. Paul is dealing with the issue of that he wishes he could be accursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites. So he's dealing with Israel in unbelief. But then he says, to whom belongs, and that's very significant there, because even in unbelief, there are certain things that still belong to Israel. Now, when Israel's in unbelief, they're not going to experience the fullness of the blessings of these things, and it doesn't mean that they are saved and in a right relationship with God salvifically, but these things still belong to Israel. They have not been lost. Well, what are these things? The adoption as sons, and the glory, and the covenants, and the giving of the law, and the temple service, and the promises, whose are the fathers, and from whom is the Christ according to the flesh, who is over all God blessed forever. Amen. So that's a lot of things there. And I would actually say that these things are probably what Paul was referring to as the gifts in Romans 11:29. Remember, he said the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Well, what are the gifts that have been given to Israel that still belong to Israel? Notice adoption as sons. Now, adoption and sons is often used of individual Christians in this church age. And those are true, obviously, for us. I mean, if you're a believer in Jesus, you've been adopted as a son. But that sort of language is also used of Israel as a nation. When it comes to the glory, that refers to the Shekinah glory. When it comes to the covenants, the great covenants of promise, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, the new, that those things still belong to Israel. Now, I should have mentioned here that we also had the giving of the law. And I didn't mention that in the list here, but that's something we should mention as well. That's not a statement that we're currently under the Mosaic law, but the giving of the law is something that was given to Israel. Notice also you have temple service, that belongs to Israel. The promises of the Old Testament, those belong to Israel. Those have not been forfeited or transferred in a way that leaves out Israel. Notice that Israel still belongs to the patriarchs of Israel. Their relationship to the patriarchs is still significant, which if I could just dip down here to Acts 3:25-26, in a speech that Paul was giving to the men of Israel after Jesus ascended in Acts chapter 3, he speaks to the men of Israel and says, "It is you who are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So unbelieving Israel is still linked with the Abrahamic covenant. Now, Peter's also going to call on them, according to Acts 3:19-21, to repent and to return and to believe in Jesus the Messiah. So there is that necessity of belief on the part of national Israel. But notice that Israel is still referred to as the sons of the prophets and of the covenant. And in this case, it refers to the Abrahamic covenant. And then we come back up here on this list, also the Messiah. And that's the great, a lot of people have noted in Romans 9 that Paul mentions the Messiah last because he's the greatest. He's the one that makes it all happen. So the Messiah is the greatest and most important part of the promises that are given to Israel. But these other things are significant as well. And the reason why Israel will fully experience the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the temple service and the promises and all of those great things are because of belief in Jesus the Messiah. But it is significant to note that in Romans 9:4-5, that Paul does not see these things being divorced from national Israel. He doesn't see them as all transferred to the church in such a way that Israel will never experience the blessings of those things. And then notice in point number 10 here, I should say, question number 10, how does God view unbelieving Israel, including the Israel of today? So that's a great question, right? I mean, Israel's in unbelief, and they were in unbelief in Paul's day as he addressed that. But what about even now? Well, I think the answer of Romans 11 still applies. And so when it comes to how God views unbelieving Israel, the answer is there's a dual status. And what do we mean by dual status? We mean that there are two ways to describe Israel currently in unbelief that are both true at the same time. And if you were to look at the grammar of Romans 11:28-29, the two things that Paul talks about are true for unbelieving Israel at the same time. Now, according to Romans 11:26-27, unbelieving Israel as it stands now is en route to a salvation of all Israel. So I wanted to make that clear. Romans 11:26 talks about the salvation of all Israel. But in Romans 11:28, Paul says that unbelieving Israel is an enemy of the gospel. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. I was watching somebody who was, talking about the current state of Israel, and he says, "Don't you Christians understand, that Israel is not in belief now? They're doing things that are not consistent with the Christian faith, and why are you calling them the people of God?" And so we want to be very clear on this, that those of us who believe that Israel's the people of God, we're not condoning everything Israel does. We're not saying Israel's currently in belief. We're not saying that Christians shouldn't be saddened by things that Israel and Israelites do that are not consistent with the faith of the Bible. But Paul understood that. He says that currently they are an enemy of the gospel. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But he also says they're beloved. And we have to get that second part. They are beloved for the sake of the fathers. So at the same time, they're an enemy of the gospel. They're beloved. Why are they beloved? For the sake of the fathers. That's to link it with the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, the promises of the Abrahamic covenant are irrevocable, to use the Romans 11:29 statement there. So the key thing to get from this is that Israel at the same time can be an enemy of the gospel and also beloved. Now, again, that does not mean they're currently saved, but it does mean that covenantal relationship to Israel as a nation remains. And that's because of God's commitment to the patriarchs of Israel. And again, remember, God's choosing purposes are not based on merit. They're based on God's sovereignty. They're based on his choosing purposes. And thus, Israel in unbelief can be both enemy of the gospel and beloved at the same time. And it's also true, according to Romans 11:1 and 2, that Israel is referred to as God's people. So remember, Paul stated, I say then God has not rejected his people. Has he? May it never be. And we mentioned this before, that Israel is referred to as the people of God in Romans 11:1. Notice also in Romans 11:2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Notice when you get into the foreknow language, again, that's a very intimate relationship there, God's relationship to Israel as a nation. So Israel in unbelief is referred to as the people of God. So again, we want to be clear by saying that. We're not saying Israel's saved. We're not saying everything with Israel is fine. We're not saying that Christians must agree with everything that Israel does. But the Bible calls Israel in unbelief the people of God. How else does Paul view unbelieving Israel? I think it's significant that he calls them my brethren. He calls them my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. And then also in Romans 9:4b, he says, to whom belongs the adoption as sons. Now, the language of brethren and sons is often used of Christian believers, and rightfully so. But again, remember that God's purposes can include saved individuals and can also refer to God's covenantal relationship to Israel as a whole. Now, number 12, does God have a future for corporate national Israel that currently is in unbelief? And the answer to that is an overwhelming yes. Remember, that was depicted in the very foundational text of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 10. So if you go and look at that passage, God predicted Israel would go into the land in belief, but then there would be a time where they were in unbelief and would have experienced dispersion and scattering to the nations. But after that, at some point, there would be a circumcision of the heart, a salvation, and a restoration to the land with blessings. And that sort of thing is reaffirmed in Romans 11. And what do we have in Romans 11:25b through 26a? Paul says a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. So as God's purposes for the Gentiles in this age unfold, and there ends up being a fullness of that, then there's going to come a salvation of all Israel. So all Israel will be saved. All Israel refers to the people and leaders as a whole at the point in time in which the event is being described in the Bible. So in connection and after the fullness of the Gentiles, there's a salvation of all Israel. In this age, according to Romans 11:1 to 10, there's a remnant of individual Israelites who believed. But then verses 11 through 27 talk about the salvation of all Israel. So Israel currently in unbelief is headed for a salvation and restoration. Now, I don't mention this here, but if you were to read the end of verse 26 with verse 27, Paul will actually quote Isaiah 59, verses 20 to 21, which talks about national Israel. If you read Isaiah 59, it talks about Israel's sin and then Israel's confession of sin. And then Isaiah 59, 20 to 21 talks about a redeemer coming to Israel, and then my spirit being upon Israel, and Israel actually joining the new covenant at that particular time. I think we also have to take into account Romans 11, verse 12 and verse 15. I think I just quote one verse here. I think it's verse 12 that I quote here. But do you know that the Bible predicts that the world will get better when Israel's fullness occurs? We're told that now if Israel's transgression is riches for the world and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment or literally fullness be? So we like to call this a "you ain't seen nothing yet" verse. Notice that Israel's current transgression, their unbelief, which would include rejection of Jesus as Messiah, it's riches for the world, and Israel's for those riches for the Gentiles. So if you're a Gentile believer in this age, you have lots of blessings because of Jesus the Messiah. There's a lot of blessings in the church age that we live in. So there's been a lot of great things, a lot of spiritual blessings. But notice what's coming. How much more will Israel's fullness or fulfillment be? In other words, when Israel is saved, according to Romans 11:26, things get even better for the world. That's where you have the blessings of the kingdom of God in all their dimensions. Israel, geopolitical nations, of course, the individuals that are a part of that, spiritual blessings, physical blessings. I want to be clear here, we have great spiritual blessings of the covenants of promise in this age, but things are going to be even better. How much more will their fulfillment be? So Israel's coming salvation will lead to even a better stage for the world and for world history. Now, when we come to number 13, can the church view Israel as God's people? And the answer to that is yes. And the reason for that is because the Bible says so. So if somebody today is saying, yeah, I believe Israel is the people of God, they're not just making that up. That is something that the Old Testament and the New Testament says. That is something that Paul explicitly reaffirms in Romans chapter 11. So it is okay to say that. Now, again, it is not a statement that Israel is currently saved as a nation. It's not a statement that you don't have to believe in Jesus to be saved. But Israel is chosen by God, and there's implications for that. And then number 14, what believing that Israel is God's people does not mean. It does not mean that an Israelite can be saved apart from Jesus. It does not mean that Israel doesn't need the gospel. It doesn't mean that Israel never does anything wrong. It doesn't mean that Christians always have to say that everything Israel does is great. It's not saying that. Nor is this, and then also, it's not saying that Gentiles who believe are not God's people, because they are. Romans 9:24-26 indicates that Gentiles are God's people. By the way, it was predicted in the Old Testament that in addition to believing Israel, that Gentiles would also become the people of God. Did you know in the latter verses of Isaiah 19, we're told in addition to Israel being the people of God, that Egypt will also be the people of God and Assyria will be the people of God. So you're going to actually have nations who become the people of God. One of the important things to understand is that the New Testament does not teach that the concept of Israel expands to include believing Gentiles, but it does teach that the concept of the people of God will expand from Israel to also include believing Gentiles and nations. So Israel doesn't expand to include everybody who believes, but the concept of the people of God will expand to include believing Gentiles and believing nations. So in the end, the concept of the people of God ends up being very inclusive and very broad. But as that occurs, Israel is still referred to as the people of God, and they still have a specific identity as Israel. Just to come back to the original title of this, Israel and the people of God, and addressing the issue, is Israel the people of God? Again, the answer to that is yes, but we also have to take into account all the factors that we've looked at, and we have to look at a lot of data. Be aware of anybody who just appeals to one or two verses as they're trying to explain this issue. We need to deal seriously with the Old Testament text. We need to deal seriously with Romans 9-11. We need to deal with what's going on in Acts 3 and other texts. But when you put that all together, I think what has been presented here is an accurate depiction when it comes to the issue of Israel and the people of God.